Hello, hello. Welcome to Jewish Ideas. I know the setting changes every time, but that's because one computer isn't working or was working and stopped working. So I'm in my office with my iPad set up on a coffee table, ready to talk to you about, in part, an idea that has to do with what we're all experiencing. And also has to do somewhat indirectly, excuse me, with the Parsha this week, because as you may know, we're beginning the book of Bamidbar, which in English is translated Numbers, but in Hebrew means in the wilderness. And in the wilderness is where the Israelites are for the book from the moment they leave Egypt until the end of Deuteronomy, till the end of Devarim. In other words, through the duration of the Torah. And so I thought that both thematically in our lives and in the Torah, it would be worth talking about a really important Jewish idea, which is exile. The exile of human beings does not start with Egypt or with Abraham. The truth is that in the Torah, humanity is sort of born in exile from the moment that Adam and Eve leave the Garden of Eden. Because the way the sort of mythic history of humanity is set up in the Jewish tradition is that they're placed into home, that the garden is the home of the natural home of the human being. It's where we should be. It's the ideal place. It's, if you follow for the rest of up to the story of Noah, it's where we were vegetarians and didn't kill and didn't eat other animals and had enough food and everything was ideal. Now, I'm not suggesting, you can have this argument on your own, that the Garden of Eden was a historical place. It's actually irrelevant to the deeper truth that it is psychologically and spiritually a very powerful motif, that human beings are born in some sense historically into a perfect place, and then remember, after they leave, what does God do? God puts a spinning sword at the mouth of the garden so that human beings can never get back. And the garden still exists. That is the idea of ending exile, of coming home, of perfection, of the ideal. It still exists. It lives within us, but we can't get there. And so the way the Torah sets up the history of humanity, not just of Jews, but the history of humanity, is to say that humanity is born into exile from the very beginning. I mean, our duration in the Garden of Eden was very brief. And once we go into exile, the things that befall us are characteristic of our being exiled in different ways, because the two most notable things that happen post-Eden are, one, that it says Adam knew his wife Eve. In other words, that there is coupling, that there is sex, that there is intimacy, which is an attempt, obviously, of reclaiming the original wholeness and closeness that home represents, and the murder of Abel by Cain, which represents the ultimate estrangement even between brothers, because remember that the part of the symbolism of creating one original couple is that therefore everyone is in fact a sister or brother. And so the exile that results from Eden automatically widens out from the notion of an exile that is physical, which is almost a trivial kind of exile ultimately, into an exile that is spiritual and existential. And the grappling with the notion of the existential exile of the human spirit is, I think, in large part, the motif of the rest of the Torah. And what I want to do today in the next several minutes is spin out a couple of those exiles, both in the Torah and Jewish history, and also on this varied metaphysical plane. So the idea that you have a home and that you're trying to get to that home is given a special sort of twist when God says to Abraham, leave the house of your father, me'artzecha, mimoladcha, u'mibeit avicha, from your home, from your land, from the place where you were born, from the house of your father. So there is a double implication here. One is that God is driving Abraham into exile because you're leaving your home and your birthplace and the house of your father. But the other is that God is trying to cure Abraham's exile by bringing Abraham to the place where he really will belong, the place you're supposed to be. And that's why the rabbinic backstories about Abraham are all how he didn't really belong there, that there being where he grew up, not there being Israel. He didn't really belong there because there was a place, it was a place of idolatry and he was not an idolater, or it was a place of polytheism and he was a monotheist. And in other words, it was a spiritual exile from someone who felt deeply different from the world in which he lived. And that sense of deep difference, of being an exile from one's surroundings, is something that the Jews and the Jewish tradition has a theme that it has struck again and again and again and again. If there are, and I suppose that there are, in any national literature, deep themes that recur over and over and over again, one that is a constant motif of Jewish literature is the sense of not belonging in the place where you find yourself. In fact, in the Torah, it speaks several times about a ger toshav, which literally means a stranger resident. And the Maggid of Dubna explains it as follows. It says, that's what you are in the world. Anyone who feels too much like a resident doesn't realize that they're really a stranger. But anyone who feels too much like a stranger doesn't realize that you're also resident, and we are all both. We are in this world, and yet we are strangers to it and estranged from it. Certainly, this is not a lesson that comes as a surprise to anybody who feels uneasy in the world at the moment. And that unease is a reality that follows the biblical story through the entirety of the Bible, where the world is never a perfect and harmonious place. There is no utopia in the biblical story, and except for Eden, and what is promised in Israel, but actually, once you get to Israel, is clearly not what Israel proves to be. In fact, it's a much more complicated place than the simple utopia you might expect. And so throughout the biblical story, the reality of estrangement, of exile from one's surroundings, even when those surroundings are, in terms of sovereignty, physically, geographically, home. Because once you get to the books of Kings and Samuel, you you discover that even though Israel is sovereign, there is still this sense of unease that persists. And of course, once you get to the rabbinic period, which is later on in Jewish history, the rabbis feel it so keenly because they are in actual physical exile. And yet, what they yearn for is a return to a kind of Israel that never fully existed, right? An Israel where not only will there be a resumption of sacrifices at the temple, but a messianic age where all the, or many at least, depending on your interpretation of the Messiah, which was a subject of a previous class, many of the difficulties and strife of life will have been smoothed out and made easier by virtue of the promise that is fulfilled in the messianic idea. Once this notion of exile is established, though, and once the rabbis recognize that they are estranged from the world as it is in their imaginations, although it is never quite that way in reality, then other exiles start to come into play. And then the sense of exile takes on a different quality. So the Hasidim, for example, the Hasidic masters talk about the person's exile from himself, that your soul sits uneasily inside you, that you aren't who you should be, that there is an internal split in human beings between the true characteristics of their soul as given and the way that they manifest them in the world. And in this sense, the goal of the human being and the exemplar of the tzaddik is somebody who is not estranged from him or herself, right? Somebody who is actually integrated. In modern parlance, we would talk about them as being psychologically integrated, I suppose, but that's not the religious language. But somebody who is toho kavoro, as the Talmud puts, his inside is like his outside. Somebody who is in fact not a split person, but is at home inside herself. And by being at home, expresses no deep sense of internal exile, even though such a person will inevitably feel a certain amount of exile from the world, since the world is not as it should be. That self-estrangement is also played out in terms of the soul with regard to God. And here, there's a really interesting sort of dual theological approach that exists within our tradition. The first being very easy to understand, and the second being very difficult. The one that is easy, I mean, they're both easy to understand intellectually, but to grasp spiritually. The one that is easy is that the human being is estranged from God. This is expressed most famously in the Kotzker Rebbe saying, where is God? And all his students said, God is everywhere. And he said, no, God is wherever we let God in. And that idea that you can estrange yourself from God, that you can will yourself far from the creator of the universe, is an idea that seems counterintuitive, but the more you think about it, the more you understand that in order to be able to speak about somebody having a relationship to God, that relationship only exists if it is possible to not have a relationship. Otherwise, how can you say that someone is close to God unless it is possible for someone to be far from God? And people do feel far from God at times, as we all know. And the second part of that, the more complicated part, in some ways the more interesting part, and the part that seems less susceptible to easy understanding, is that God is exiled from us. So, in one way, you can see this as a pedagogic technique. And by that, I mean, there's a story of a man who came to the Baal Shem Tov and said, when I was young, I felt very close to God. And now that I'm older, I feel very far away. And the Baal Shem Tov said, well, that makes sense, because when you're young and you're learning to walk, so your parent takes you by the hand and stands with you as you learn to walk, but gradually, as you learn more and more, the parent moves further and further away. God has done the same, and now you must learn to walk to God. In other words, agency, the assumption of agency, the ability to do what you want, the growth of the human will requires a certain space. So God moves away to give you the space, not to stay far from God, but in order to approach. But in order to approach, you have to have the ability to do it. And God is not a helicopter parent in this reading. God gives you a little space. But the more difficult notion is that God is in exile from Israel, from human beings. The way that it's put in the Talmud is that when Israel went to Egypt, it's as if God went into exile with Israel into Egypt. And at other times that God hides God's face, hester panim, the idea that God is somehow hidden from us, estranged from us, in exile from us. And you can imagine that during the most difficult times of Jewish history, like the Shoah, primarily, but not only the Shoah, this notion that God was in exile was something that was very often spoken about and written about. And without going into the question for the moment, because we're not discussing the question of evil right now, without going into the question for the moment of whether this is a good or a bad explanation of what goes on in the world, it shows the extent to which the idea of exile is deeply intertwined in the Jewish experience of the world. So much so that not only is an individual in exile, not only are the people in exile, but even God is in exile. And that the way that you bring God closer out of exile are all the traditional ways that you would think, by mitzvot, by prayer, by ritual, all the things that Jews do in order to close the gap somewhat between the God who is in exile and the people who seek God. But it starts at the very beginning. And the nation that builds its psyche around the possibility of a home, which is, after all, what Abraham is promised at the beginning, and promised at the beginning, or close to the beginning, that his people will be pushed away and have to come back. But any people that builds their psyche around the notion of a home also builds their psyche around the possibility of exile. Right? Because if you are constructed around reaching a certain goal, then not having that goal, then the reverse of that goal is constantly presents itself to your imagination. And when Zionism became a national movement, the understanding of exile was transformed in some ways, and it was made more physical and given sort of rocket fuel by the metaphysical. And what I mean by that is all of a sudden, it was actually thought possible to have a physical state in the land of Israel, which is something that for most of Jewish history was going to happen miraculously or not at all. God was going to pick the Jews up in a magic sweep and return them to Israel. And until God was ready to do that, you had to stay in Lodz or in Pinsk or in Beverly Hills, one of the three. But once Zionism started to say we can establish this physical end to exile, then the metaphysical tropes begin to play into how powerful it was to return. And the idea that we were ending, in some sense, the metaphysical exile, that the Jews were returning in a deep spiritual and historical sense to the land that they had yearned for, gave Zionism something much, much more powerful than just we want sovereignty in a land. And a lot of the quasi-utopian visions, the almost perfect place ideas that some of the early Zionist philosophers like Aleph Dalet Gordon spoke about when they talked about Israel, though he himself did not speak about it as God doing this, but as the Jewish people doing this, were nonetheless given force by the reality that exile was such a powerful idea in the Jewish mind that returning home became something more than just going back to a piece of land. It became going home with all that means. In the way, if you'll forgive me the reference, but it's deep within me, in the way that Dorothy means it when she clicks her heels together from Oz. She wants to go home. And home, no matter how nice the diaspora might be, and Oz, after all, is in color, and home is in black and white, home is home. And that's why the notion of what in Israel is called shlilat hagolah, the denigration of the diaspora, the idea that the diaspora would never, ever, ever be what Israel could be, was so important and so powerful. It still exists, but especially at the beginning of the founding of Israel, because there was this long history, almost starting at Eden, but certainly starting with Abraham, that this was the place where you were supposed to be. And for thousands of years now, since the 2nd century AD, Jews have been deprived of the opportunity of being there in a state that they could call their own. And so with the establishment of the state of Israel was the end, in some ways, of the physical exile. But we live, as we do today in our COVID world, with the metaphysical exile, with the reality that the world will always be a little bit of a stranger to us and we to it, and that we are, each of us, a ger toshav, a stranger and a resident. And sometimes it will feel more like home, and sometimes it will feel more like this is not our place. And may it feel more like home soon. So thanks for joining me for the theme of exile. See you tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, for Torah class. Bye.